Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, February 9th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about President Donald Trump now clearing the field for David Perdue in the governor election in the state of Georgia. Now, you might be asking, why am I showing you an endorsement from President Trump from Fox 5 Atlanta saying that Donald Trump endorses Vernon Jones in Georgia's 10th congressional district race? You know, why does a congressional race have any type of implication over the governor's race? Now, if you've been closely watching the Georgia political environment, what you might know is that Vernon Jones actually was the first Republican besides Brian Kemp to announce that he was running for governor in an effort to primary the incumbent governor. And, you know, in that primary campaign, Vernon Jones very closely aligned himself with President Trump. And in many cases, he sought out the endorsement from President Trump, and he truly wanted to be the next governor of the state. Now, if you want a bit about history on Vernon Jones, this is not the point of the video, but just for a little bit of context, Vernon Jones was a long life Democrat. You know, he was a long-standing Democrat, someone who had been a member of that party and actually served in state office through the Democratic Party, until he switched political parties to endorse President Donald Trump. Now, in many ways, this was initially thought of as a grift, and that's not really up for my consideration at this point in time. I'm just simply telling you what the initial expectation was and what many people thought this race was actually going to end up being for Vernon Jones. But he continued to move down this pathway of being a pro-Trump type of candidate, someone who had been, you know, an ex-Democrat, now excommunicated from the party, who sought out that endorsement so heavily. And for the longest time, he refused to leave the race, even though Donald Trump had actually endorsed David Perdue, and he knew that at that point he would not receive the endorsement. Vernon Jones still remained in the United States governor race for Georgia. And with him being in that race, what you might know actually is that he was endorsed by some other candidates who were very similar to President Trump. For instance, what you had is Michael Flynn, someone who had served under the Trump administration. You had Rudy Giuliani, someone who had been a very well-known name tied to President Trump. Vernon Jones got some of these more early endorsements. He got some of the endorsements that were closely tied to President Trump, and he thought that would be enough. But when President Trump decided to endorse David Perdue, it seemed as if that there was a point, where Vernon Jones needed to switch political aspirations. He needed to move over to a different type of election to at least earn that endorsement, and that's exactly what he did. Rather than remain in the governor's race, Vernon Jones decided to now run for Georgia's 10th congressional district, where we can actually take a look at here, in which it has a partisan lean of Republican plus 31. Previously, this district wasn't competitive either. It had a partisan lean of Republican plus 28, but the Republicans gerrymandered the state of Georgia in an effort to shore up all of their incumbents, and it's going to happen in the 10th district. Now, you might see that there's an incumbent there, Jody Hice, and you might be thinking, what happens to this incumbent now that President Trump has made the endorsement? Well, again, not the purpose of this video, but just for a little bit of information, Jody Hice is actually now running for Secretary of State, the same position that Brian Kemp was in back in 2018. So, referring back to our initial point of this video, talking about the governor's race, okay, you're asking, how does this impact the race? How does this clear the field? If he didn't receive the endorsement from President Trump, was he really a viable candidate? And the answer is no. He was not a viable candidate. Now, earlier on, when there was no entrance of David Perdue in the race, the polling numbers had Brian Kemp and Vernon Jones in a position where, at least earlier on, Vernon Jones wasn't getting a significant amount of support, but he was still getting about a fourth or a fifth of the Republican Party vote. So straight off the bat, what you might have noticed is that Brian Kemp probably was going to defeat Vernon Jones. What the Republicans needed, at least in this primary, if they wanted to truly get rid of Brian Kemp, was someone who was elected statewide before and knows the Republican electorate well. And no one better than David Perdue, except for maybe Doug Collins or Herschel Walker, but neither of which are deciding to run in the race. But David Perdue entered into the race, and immediately following that announcement, and in addition to President Trump's endorsement, David Perdue has significantly climbed in the polls, doing 20% better than before he had even entered into the race, and now neck and neck with Brian Kemp. But one thing that you might notice is that while Brian Kemp and David Perdue are neck and neck, one candidate in particular, before he had dropped out, was actually getting about a tenth of the vote. Now, before David Perdue made the announcement, Vernon Jones was getting about 19%, 25% of polls, which was a good result, simply because of the fact that there was, no one else there, but it was still something that can be attributed to his campaign. Even after Donald Trump had made the endorsement for David Perdue, Vernon Jones still remained with about 10, 11 to 12% of the electorate. While it doesn't seem like that's a consequential amount, considering that Brian Kemp was only above David Perdue in the most recent poll by a margin of just 7 percentage points, 10% can truly make all the difference. And considering that David Perdue is currently on an upward trend, Vernon Jones withdrawing from the race and now endorsing David Perdue gives David Perdue enough momentum to in the next poll potentially overcome Brian Kemp. And looking at the polls actually in Fabrizio Lee and Associates, they did a poll in August 2021 and then in December of 2021, and they actually posed this scenario to voters, that if Vernon Jones was to drop out of the race in addition to other Republicans, who would you support? And a runoff actually is very routine in Georgia, as David Perdue can tell you. In the state of Georgia, if the Republican primary ends up being to a point where nobody gets above 50%, which is very possible considering some of these more recent polling numbers, you head off into a runoff election. So this runoff election would only allow you two options, Brian Kemp or David Perdue. So Vernon Jones removing himself from the race makes this a lot likelier. And looking at the Brian Kemp, David Perdue numbers, what you might find is that earlier on, Brian Kemp in August of 2021 defeated David Perdue by 6 points, but now David Perdue wins by 3. And a lot of this has to do with the Trump endorsement. And Brian Kemp actually knows this better than anyone. Looking at the Georgia governor election results back in 2018, the Republican primary actually had the lieutenant governor, Casey Cagle, ahead with 39% of the vote. Brian Kemp, at being the Secretary of State, was only getting 27%. Hunter Hill actually was nearly there, and I remember covering this race in specific back when I made election videos about the Georgia governor's race. It's crazy to think about that we are over 4 years later. I cannot even, right now I'm having a bit of a reflection moment. That's crazy to think about. But the point is that this Republican primary went into a position where Casey Cagle and Brian Kemp were headed to a runoff, and Casey Cagle was certain to win that. I mean, he was a statewide elected official, as was Brian Kemp, but Casey Cagle more so. He was someone who had been, well known across the state. He was a top name within the GOP. I mean, he was literally the lieutenant governor of the state, right? But here's the thing. President Trump decided to endorse Brian Kemp instead. And on election day, Brian Kemp won the GOP nomination. Not only did he win it, though, but Casey Cagle received less votes in the runoff, not necessarily because of less turnout. What you will find is that actually the turnout was near similar. What you will notice, though, is that Casey Cagle received, 50,000 votes less in the runoff election, and Brian Kemp received over 100 to 200,000 more votes in the runoff election, simply because President Trump endorsed him. That's the crazy thing about this. That's the thing that really strikes me as, this is the impact of the Trump endorsement. And Brian Kemp once benefited from it, and now it is to his detriment. Because with Donald Trump's endorsement of Vernon Jones, the endorsement strikes again. Not in a way that makes Vernon Jones prop up electorally in the state of Georgia in terms of the governor's race, but actually forces him to change paths. Just 5 days ago, I went on Vernon Jones's Twitter to take a look at what he talks about. Vernon Jones, 5 days ago, was talking about how the establishment media didn't want to fairly cover his governor's race, how he was being targeted by, specific groups because of his governor's race, how he was committed to it through and through. And yet, now, with the Trump endorsement, he is deciding completely to drop the governorship. And now run for Congress, and it makes sense. I mean, if you are given it out, I want you to take a look at this, for you personally, think about this for just a moment. If you are in a governor's race where you could prove to be a spoiler against a type of candidate that your top guy, Donald Trump, does not want to support, you can stay in the race and do that, or you can enter into Congress. You're being given an open and easy out. You're being given an opportunity to be in Congress for decades. Congressional incumbents win time and time again. Unless the Democrats are able to gerrymander the state of Georgia in 2030, there is no real certainty that the state of Georgia will be a state in which the Democratic Party will be able to oust anyone out of this 10th congressional district. And considering the fact that Donald Trump has endorsed Vernon Jones, all Vernon Jones has to do is vote with the Republican Party, and he's set for life. Quite literally, set for life. So by entering into the governor's race as someone who was viewed as an opportunist, he is now ending up in Congress 100%. There is no chance that a Democrat wins there, and any Democrat who would be willing to oppose them would only be wasting the Democratic Party's money. And with his exit from the race, David Perdue now increases in chances. And this is also something that I do want to point out, that David Perdue now rising in chances makes it so the possibilities and odds are about 50-50 now. Still, some people expected Brian Kemp to do better in the runoff election simply because he was the incumbent. I don't know if that's entirely true, but what the numbers from January 2022 do tell us is that Brian Kemp does defeat David Perdue by a margin of about 6 percentage points. But keep in mind, when you take in all of the other Trump-style candidates in addition, David Perdue actually jumps up to 50%, and that leaves 5% undecided and 1% going to the other. But the governor's race in, 2018 was competitive, as you can expect, whereas the Democrats knew it was going to be Stacey Abrams. She won with 77% of the vote, and it wasn't competitive in the least bit. Now, one thing that actually jogged a bit of memory, and this is a little bit off track, Stacey Evans I used as the Democratic nominee for governor in one of my predictions simply because at that time there was no polling data and no indicator that Stacey Abrams was going to win, so I just chose a random Stacey in that position, and it ended up being incorrect, but there were other times in which I used Stacey Abrams. But in 2018, the Democrats knew who their nominee was going to be straight off the bat, and they had more time to prepare for the general election. Maybe that can explain why Georgia all of a sudden was one of the closer governor races, despite it never even being on the radar for Democrats 4 years prior. But looking at the 2022 race, we're actually seeing the exact same thing happen right now, because everybody knows that Stacey Abrams is going to be the Democratic governor candidate. She has 99 cents for a yes share on PredictIt, and people are 100% confident in knowing this. For the Republican side, what you find is that it is an exact split. Vernon Jones has reduced to 1. Doug Collins has reduced to 1. Herschel Walker is 1. But David Perdue and Brian Kemp, 50 cents for a yes share. Now, on the 90-day trend, actually, this wasn't true. Looking at the earlier numbers, Brian Kemp had started off with a pretty considerable lead. But after David Perdue made the announcement and the endorsement was made, David Perdue skyrocketed in the betting odds, and people expected Perdue to win. But then things started to narrow up. People started to realize that some of the more recent polling numbers actually ended up in a position where Brian Kemp was potentially going to defeat David Perdue simply because of the candidates like Vernon Jones and Candace Taylor that might prolong the consolidation behind David Perdue. With this Trump endorsement and considering the upward mobility of David Perdue's electoral trends, it is entirely possible that Donald Trump is able to hand David Perdue a victory in the initial primary, that it won't even need to head to a runoff election. But that also is a big if. But just looking at the way that these trends have changed, while Perdue did soar high and actually is doing worse now than he was before, Brian Kemp actually resurged in support. And after that poll was released, Brian Kemp actually started to maintain a lead. But now they're about neck and neck. And that's probably because Vernon Jones' exit from the race makes it difficult to see how the GOP is going to move forward at this point in time. Considering that there is now going to be some significant consolidation behind David Perdue and Brian Kemp on their respective sides, and more party establishment figures behind Brian Kemp and more pro-Trump type candidates besides behind David Perdue. It's just quite funny also to me that this was the exact opposite situation back in 2018. It's something that is just really fascinating to see how quickly President Trump can turn on someone and how that can really doom them electorally. But I think that the Republican Party, with now a clear field, doesn't actually, give us a better position for understanding how this election will end up. One thing that I do expect to see now is that while Georgia is a tilt Republican seat, I don't know if this primary cleared field is going to actually change this rating too much. One thing that I do think that the Republican Party really wants is that at least one of the candidates wins with an outright majority in the early primary. Because right now, Stacey Abrams can focus and is focusing on the general election, whereas the Republicans need to focus on themselves. David Perdue is attacking Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp is attacking David Perdue. Donald Trump is attacking Brian Kemp. Donald Trump is helping David Perdue. It's a lot of infighting, and it's a lot of things that are unfortunate for the GOP's look. Whereas the Democratic Party is simply sitting there and saying, we have our nominee, we know who it's going to be, and we are going to focus on hounding Republicans time and time again in this, governor race. And it could very well be an effective method. Having additional months on your opponents is a very big advantage in a governor election. And in the state of Georgia, where Stacey Abrams nearly won back in 2018, she doesn't need to do anything more for name recognition. In fact, she's probably a well-known name nationwide. So all around, what I think that we should take away from this is the fact that Donald Trump, I think, is trying to find a way to prop up David Perdue to win with over 50% of the vote in the first round. No point in prolonging it to a runoff election when you can get rid of the person who is potentially leading you that way by offering them a congressional position. And also, in a way, Donald Trump is knocking out two birds with one stone by getting someone in the Georgia governorship potentially, and also in Congress for sure, that will be at his beck and call. If these people are to be won and elected on the backs of Donald Trump's endorsements, they will owe him a lot. And he could very well do exactly what he did to Brian Kemp. Endorse them now, but eventually turn on them if they decide to move away from him. Donald Trump's endorsement is gold in the Republican Party. It is the most sought after thing, and it is very difficult to get. Vernon Jones is lucky enough that he got one because now he's going to be in Congress and set for life. David Perdue is also lucky that he received the endorsement from President Trump because prior to the endorsement, David Perdue wasn't polling that well. So all around, I think that we are going to find that Donald Trump's endorsements are very impactful in some ways and maybe not so impactful in others. David Perdue, I think, is probably a less electable candidate than Brian Kemp, but then on the flip side, one could argue that maybe Brian Kemp is going to excite the Republican base significantly less because of the fact that he does have a history of being at odds with President Trump. There's a lot to be unpacked here. There's a lot to be understood, and it's not going to take just one video. As we continue through this Republican primary, I will continue to update you guys, and the primary, I'm not entirely sure exactly what day it is, but it looks like we are going to get some results, hopefully in the near future, and potentially make some more accurate predictions as to how the Georgia governor race will go, depending on who the GOP decides to go with. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen is a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. In fact, governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.